and Evictions Task Force. And I just want to remind everyone, first, if you wouldn't mind muting, mute your microphone if you're not talking or presenting, just so everyone can hear. Thanks. And this meeting is being recorded. By participating in the meeting, as you know, you're consenting to be recorded, and the recordings will be posted on the task force website. And as I mentioned, please mute the microphone if you're not talking. And there'll be other meetings coming up. We'll talk about that later at the end of the agenda. And if you have any questions during the course, we only have one presenter today, and we're hoping that this is going to be more participatory. I know it's always a little awkward on these virtual platforms, but I do hope we'll be able to hear from one another. I don't want to be the only one talking at our task force meeting. But for the first half hour, I actually do want only one person to be talking, and that is we are very fortunate to have Rachel Rossi here from the Department of Justice. She is coming today. She'll be presenting the first half hour of our agenda, and then we'll move into some work that we need to attend to as a task force. But we thought it was important to get the federal perspective. We've been fortunate to hear from other jurisdictions, learn more about their programs, their insights about what makes an effective program. And we've also heard from a lot of stakeholders within our state, different agencies who've been involved in the implementation and thinking about access to counsel and the eviction situation in Maryland. So now today we have the opportunity to hear the federal perspective. I think that's the last piece really as a task force to hear what has been going on. There's been a lot happening at the federal level, as we know. We've certainly heard that in the rental assistance context, but we want to hear more directly about the federal response and how it relates to our charge, which is standing up an access to counsel and evictions program. So without further ado, and I don't have your resume in front of me, Rachel, you were so kind to join us sort of at the last minute, and we appreciate your being here. Maybe you could take a minute to introduce yourself, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you everyone for allowing me to join this meeting. Just seeing what you all are doing and what you're focused on and how critically important it is. It's an honor to be here with you, and also hearing a little bit about the meetings you've already had and what you're diving into, such important issues here. And so my name is Rachel Rossi. I am a Deputy Associate Attorney General in the Department of Justice. So that means that I work with Vanita Gupta in the Associate Attorney General's office. And some of you may know the Associate Attorney General oversees a lot of the civil components, the Civil Rights Division, the grant making components, and also the Office for Access to Justice. And so I also work on hate crimes and a number of other issues for the department. But one of the big things that I'm focused on right now is the Access to Justice office and standing that work back up. So, and Victoria, would you like me to just launch in and talk a little bit about what's been going on, or?
Absolutely. I think it'd be very helpful if you we'll have minor interruptions. But yes, if you wouldn't mind, just jump right in. We'd really like to hear what you have to say about some of the initiatives at the federal level.
Absolutely. And I should also throw out there that I am a former county and federal public defender. So access to counsel is a huge issue that I'm very passionate about. You know, as a lot was happening in the federal government, looking at what can the federal government do to assist with housing and to prevent evictions and foreclosures. It sounds like you have already dove into a lot of what the federal assistance, rental assistance programs looked like, a lot of those actions, but also a big piece of this was looking at how can the federal government facilitate access to legal services in eviction proceedings. And as you all know very well, The access to counsel in eviction proceedings is huge and can make all the difference, and is so rarely afforded in jurisdictions across the country. So as some of you may have seen, on May 18th, President Biden and Attorney General Garland issued memos officially standing back up the DOJ Office for Access to Justice and officially reconvening the Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable. And the Office for Access to Justice at DOJ is the staff for the Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable. And the reason I raise that is the roundtable, as you may recall,
Rachel, I think we're having some problems with the audio. Rachel, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think your audio is problematic. Rachel, could I suggest perhaps that you may want to get off and get on again? Here. Rachel, Rachel, I just need to stop you for a minute, Rachel. We are unable to hear
because my internet. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Okay, we can hear you now. Yes.
Let me try calling in.
Okay, you're clear now, actually, which is interesting, but we could not hear what you said before this. Okay, all right, we're going to hold tight for a minute. It looks as if Rachel's going to try and call us, since I think we missed, unfortunately, most of what she had to say. And I would just remind the task force members that on our Google Drive, there are some materials.
Hi.
Really, oh, there you go, Rachel. We can hear you clear as a bell. Okay.
So sorry about that. You can hear me okay now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry, my internet has been all over the place today, so thanks for your patience. I was just talking a little bit about the Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, a convening of over 28 federal agencies that come together essentially to look at what do we do to facilitate access to justice and access to counsel across federal government. So as we're looking at these federal funding programs and initiatives, seeing that access to counsel is such a critical part to making these programs and this federal funding actually effective. And so the first report of the roundtable was mandated to look at what COVID did and how COVID impacted access to justice across federal government, and to look at what agencies did in response, what innovations came out of that, and specifically how can we learn from what was done and utilize these practices for the future. So I am happy to send all of you a copy of the Interagency Roundtable report, but it had a specific section focusing on eviction and foreclosures, and specifically kind of outlining what are the different federal programs that were utilized specifically to include funding for legal resources and for attorneys and for representation in eviction and foreclosure scenarios. So I can highlight just a few of the different areas that were highlighted in that report, but I think it's a really good snapshot just to look at what federal government can do and what it has been doing specifically in the kind of increased crisis over the pandemic. So one big area, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, actually did a lot in this space. They developed tools for homeowners, renters, and landlords to identify funding and resources, including developing a rental assistance finder tool. And they targeted outreach and demonstrations, including targeting legal aid intermediaries and a broad array of direct service providers. And CFPB also developed a housing portal to connect homeowners and renters struggling with housing insecurity with resources that included legal help. CFPB also engaged in a lot of rulemaking and guidance initiatives to assist civil legal aid providers and the courts, and to support self-help approaches that could help keep people in their homes. They issued a final rule in 2021 to help ensure consumers have time to explore their options before foreclosure referral, and to allow mortgage servicers to get borrowers into affordable mortgage payment plans faster. That 2021 rule also ensured that borrowers would be able to find contact information for housing counselors. And the CFPB issued plain language compliance aids to assist legal aid providers in describing the rule to their clients. It also issued guidance to help legal aid providers understand COVID-19 related compliance issues, including language access requirements, and a compliance bulletin urging servicers to dedicate sufficient resources and staff to meet borrowers' needs during a surge in demand. So CFPB did a lot in the space of both initiatives and also including guidance specifically focused toward legal resources and legal aid. HUD also did a number of things in this space. It announced an eviction protection grant program to support legal aid providers in assisting tenants that were at risk of eviction. This program was posted in July 2021, and the purpose of this grant program was to support experienced legal aid providers to offer legal assistance at no cost to low-income tenants at risk of or subject to eviction. And HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research is making $20 million in grant funding available for services in areas with high rates of evictions or prospective evictions. HUD also published data and analysis to encourage the use of eviction diversion programs. HUD's research division specifically provides housing research and market data used by a wide array of legal and housing advocates. And HUD has produced articles describing tenant legal needs, articles describing the importance of local and U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention moratorium, and other reports that policymakers and legal aid providers could use. There was also a letter that was written. The secretaries of HUD, Treasury, and the Attorney General all partnered together to draft a letter to governors, mayors, county executives, chief justices, and state court administrators, essentially urging more actions to prevent evictions. This was after the U.S. Supreme Court blocking of the CDC order establishing a federal eviction moratorium in August. And essentially the letter called on state, local, and court leaders to issue their own moratorium to stay evictions while rental assistance applications were being processed, and to use emergency rental assistance payments and state and local fiscal recovery funds to enhance tenant access to legal representation. Separately, the Legal Services Corporation, I'm sure you're all familiar with, conducted a national study about unmet legal needs relating to evictions. This was a congressionally directed study called The Effect of State and Local Laws on Evictions, and it investigated legal practices related to eviction and the extent of the country's unmet legal needs. The Legal Services Corporation also launched a series of web-based data tools and virtual events about eviction laws and the access to justice implications of the pandemic. Some of those tools included an eviction tracker to monitor case filings around the country, and a comprehensive database of state and local eviction laws and processes built in partnership with universities and public health. So Legal Services Corporation, of course, with a very specific focus in this area, was actively engaged. Treasury also did a number of things in this space. The Treasury issued guidance that clarified that critical funding streams could be used to support eviction diversion plans, including counseling, navigators, legal services, and court programs. According to Treasury's guidance, states and localities in partnership with court systems and legal aid providers were able to tap two sources of federal support to fund eviction diversion and housing stability efforts. So the funding used there was the ARPA $350 billion coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds and $46.5 billion in emergency rental assistance program dollars. Treasury strongly encouraged partnership with the courts to prevent eviction and made it clear that allowable services for this funding included legal services related to eviction. Treasury also had guidance to clarify that the Homeowner Assistance Fund can support legal services to help prevent foreclosure. And the Homeowner Assistance Fund, a critical component of the ARPA, provided nearly $10 billion to states, DC, territories, and the tribes to help homeowners impacted by the pandemic. Again, the Treasury guidance made it clear that this funding could be used to fund legal services related to foreclosure, prevention, or displacement. So, there were a number of different programs that, some of them very specific to the coronavirus relief funding, where it was good to see there was an explicit recognition that the access to counsel specifically in the evictions and foreclosure space was critically important. So just to sort of wrap up and give a little bit more from the Department of Justice perspective, at the Department of Justice, I think there was a lot of desire to see, what's our role? What can we do in this space, and how can we promote access to counsel? Of course, we were pleased and excited to see the Attorney General issue a memo reinvigorating the Access to Justice Office. And I think going forward, partnerships and conversations with task forces and groups and entities like yours, I think is critical so that this office is relevant and is assisting a lot of the great work that folks like you are doing already. Another effort, Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta wrote a letter in June of 2021 to all state Supreme Court Chief Justices and state court administrators, essentially urging them to adopt eviction diversion strategies and to include legal assistance. That letter encouraged state court leaders to consider adopting concrete strategies to raise awareness of rental assistance programs and to facilitate litigants' access to these funds, including by requiring landlords to apply for rental assistance before filing, modifying summons and other forms to alert litigants to the availability of eviction diversion programs and rental assistance, and partnering with community-based organizations and legal services providers to offer assistance and increase the chance for successful diversion. The letter encourages a comprehensive approach, including a combination of rental assistance, mediation, social service, and legal assistance, and lists possible sources of federal funding that could be utilized to achieve those goals. And then finally, the Attorney General issued an emergency call to action to the legal community. You may have seen this letter from the Attorney General, but essentially the Attorney General's letter called on the legal community to help address the ongoing housing and eviction crisis, calling for those that could to volunteer in pro bono spaces, and also citing the U.S. Census Bureau recent survey revealing that more than 6 million Americans are behind on their rent, and roughly half of them fear they could be evicted in the next 2 months. He urged the legal community to help applicants access emergency rental assistance programs, to volunteer with legal aid providers, to support local courts in implementing eviction diversion programs. And he also encouraged federal government attorneys to consider participating in the federal government pro bono program, specifically to take on these matters. And that program, the federal government pro bono program, is one that allows, it's run by the Department of Justice, but it is essentially a way to facilitate federal government attorneys getting placed with pro bono work in a way that makes it a little more streamlined and easier for them to access that work, and to kind of check all of the boxes needed for ethics purposes and all of that. It's something that the Attorney General is very proud of. It's something that he worked to sort of set up, I think, in his former time in DOJ. And so he's very, very focused on expanding and kind of bolstering that program. The Attorney General also encouraged leaders in law school deans, the Association of Pro Bono Counsel, the law firm Anti-Racism Alliance, the Corporation for National Community Service, among many others, encouraged their assistance and partnership, but also very much partnered with them in this call for action and issuing joint statements in support of this mission. So I know that was a huge mouthful in a very short amount of time, but just to give you some kind of broad overview of what has been going on in this space across federal government, just a little snapshot. So if anyone has any questions, maybe I'm happy to take those.
There we go. Okay, task force. Do we have questions for our speaker, Ms. Rossi? Just checking in. It was a lot of information.
A lot of you, and I can also send that report as well that kind of contains some of this and a lot more. May be useful.
Thank you. We do have that, the report. I'm not sure that we have the layer report, but we have the report to the president and some other things that are in our meeting materials for this evening. So we definitely appreciate it, but we'll take whatever you can provide to us. So I think we're interested primarily, as I said, our focus is on implementing an access to counsel program and looking at the critical elements. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the successes, if you have a sense of that, some of the elements that you think are critical for that.
Just make it work. I know how to roll.
And if we could,
okay. Don't take too long, y'all.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Rachel, did you get that question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think some of the efforts that we saw at the time of going through this, a lot of it was, I think, still early to tell the full effect. But I will say that one thing that was very sort of fascinating to us at the Department of Justice as we were thinking through what we could do in this space was seeing the big gap between the legal service providers on the ground and the pro bono attorneys who wanted to help, and just the lack of sort of access across those channels of communication. And so a big piece of what we were thinking through is how do we assist in facilitating that communication? How do we do it in a way that is responsible when, an influx of pro bono lawyers to a legal services provider that doesn't have the funding to oversee that many lawyers may not be the most effective model? How do we assist and facilitate and coordinate and utilize the efforts of the federal government that we do have and do it in a way that actually fits into what's going on the ground and what's effective? But yeah, that was definitely something that we saw as a big hurdle. And we did see some interesting models as folks explained to us, efforts to develop online dashboard systems where folks could get matched up with a need in a particular area. So you had law firm pro bono providers who, had attorneys who wanted to help and just didn't know where to go. And so we saw the Association of Pro Bono Counsel talked about their effort to stand up a dashboard that would allow an easy access to facilitate the need with the resource, I guess you could say. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, a difficult sort of conversation, because at the end of the day, you know, probably the largest need, the biggest need was financial resources. And I think being able to find ways to ensure that the financial resources are going to the correct place, while also looking at facilitating that contact and that communication across those channels and those lines was critical.
Okay, I'm going to do one follow-up. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but feel free, others, to chime in. And that is about the judiciary, the outreach from the Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta, to the judiciary. And one of the challenges, you know, we've seen is the judiciary's systems are non-electronic. We don't have electronic filing and evictions and other things, and that's been a little bit challenging to kind of coordinate this type of program. And is it appropriate to use some of the funds? We're looking at ways to help support the judiciary in this work. So we'd like to hear your thoughts about that. What are some of the examples in terms of the partnership with the judiciary to stand up a program that you think are helpful, and are those funds appropriate to help support the needs of the judiciary to update some of their systems and be able to handle the coordination required and the data that's needed?
Right. So I don't off the top of my head know the specific funding stream, but I do believe there was that ability and that capability with some of the funding. And I'm happy to kind of go back and figure that out and get you an answer with more specificity. But yes, I think that is absolutely something that was on our radar and something that we understood as a critical need. And I do think some of that funding was usable for that reason.
Well, that'd be great. And we do have a question from Luke. I think it's, does DOJ offer grant opportunities to assist with efforts like ours to stand up access to counsel?
That's another good question, and I'm taking notes here to take this back and find that out specifically. I do know that there are a number of grant programs that do focus on access to counsel, and I'm not sure whether it would be usable specifically for this purpose. So I can definitely take that back and get you an answer.
That would be terrific. As you can see, the resources are an issue, and we're trying to address some of those challenges. Okay. Do we have other questions from members of the task force? Or others who'd like to ask a question of our speaker?
Hi, can you hear me? This is Rena Shaw.
Yes, Rena. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I just was curious to know, in terms of now that the Access to Counsel office has been started and the Department of Justice restarted, I should say, in terms of what we can look forward to in the future in regards to what you expect them to be doing regarding either access to counsel or evictions or both, if there's any sort of insight into that.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that I think has been on the Attorney General's mind as we're kind of standing this office back up. I think when you look at the Attorney General's report, the way that it sort of describes the road ahead or the days to come are three large buckets, which is starting some of the kind of immediate access to justice work, some of the things that can be done in short term without having kind of the fulsome staff and budget of the office quite yet. Starting up, bucket number 2, starting up the legal aid interagency roundtable work. And then bucket 3 is continued expansion and vision casting and stakeholder engagement to determine what the final scope and what the office should look like at the end of the day. So there still is a considerable amount of growth and building that we're going to be doing in the months ahead, particularly because we are somewhat at the mercy of Congress until the FY22 budget is passed to get the office's full budget and to be really up and running. So I say that to say that as we go forward, we're going to be doing a lot of stakeholder engagement and research, and we're bringing on a lot of subject matter experts who work specifically in legal access spheres to look precisely at this issue and to see, what are the most effective models? How can DOJ be the most useful and effective in this office to facilitate legal representation? And so I would love to find ways to hear from you and to hear from your experiences as you proceed through your work in this task force. I think finding ways to kind of partner and learn from your work as well as we go forward and as we develop these models, I think would be really, really useful because we are kind of in a startup sort of phase. Some of the things that we do know are on the horizon and that we are hopeful to do in short order include things like looking at fines and fees, and some of the things that are sort of most top of mind to a lot of the stakeholders we engage with. But then looking at access to counsel specifically in evictions and proceedings and also in immigration proceedings have also been somewhat top of mind, I think, as well.
Okay.
And maybe I should throw out there that one of the things we're thinking through, is looking at existing models that provide for legal representation and determining what's really most effective and how should this office kind of engage in this space. So, we've seen models where DOJ contracts with a national nonprofit that then subcontracts with legal service providers across the country to provide representation. There's of course the grant making as an option, and so we are looking at what has worked, what's the most effective way, how do we fill in the gaps that, for example, the Legal Services Corporation can't meet just because of their narrow focus, their statutory narrow focus. And so we're kind of looking at all of it. And I think to the extent you all have developed ideas or you have suggestions on best practices or what DOJ does that actually works, happy to hear that feedback as well.
In that vein, there's a question about best practices. So the question is, are there best practices for outreach to affected tenants prior to a hearing? A challenge we're hoping to address is to reach people before court in order to avoid filings wherever possible. As part of our law, for example, there's a 10-day notice that's issued that the landlord must issue prior to filing. But we're just curious if you have any best practices that you've learned of.
I haven't that specifically, but I can definitely also take that question back to my colleagues and see if they, in their conversations in engaging in this, had learned anything. And so, Victoria, would it make most sense for me to get answers to these questions back to you?
Yes, that'd be great. If you could do that to me and to Leah, who is the Attorney General's office staffing this task force, both of us, that'd be great, and we'll share that with the group.
Perfect. Okay, I will get these answers to you all.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Are there any other questions before we thank our speaker?
Yes,
okay.
this is Rena Shah again. Can
yes,
you hear
please.
me, Vicki?
Indeed.
I wanted to, and this might not be something that you have on hand, but in terms of follow-up with Vicki and Leah, I was curious, you were describing a lot of the data dashboards and other tools that have been put into place to sort of track things. And I wanted to sort of see if you would be able to identify some of the key either organizations or people within the organizations that are really heading those up. We're trying to figure out, obviously, how to build the data infrastructure here as well. And it's a big part of the implementation. So it would be really helpful to sort of understand, how the national experts have been thinking about these things and who they are.
Absolutely. I did have a good conversation about that issue, and I have my notes. I can go back and get that information as well, but specifically drilling down even into, what are the common providers and software companies that do this sort of work and the different models of how it works. I can get that information for you as well.
Okay. All right then. Well, I think at this time, I don't see any further questions in the chat. And if folks are done with their questions, we're going to say thank you to Rachel Rossi for coming today. We really appreciate it. This was very helpful. I think some of the materials that you've referenced are, as I was going to mention, currently on the Google Drive, the task force Google Drive. So please, members of the task force, feel free to consult those. I think Leah also sent them via chat, although mine weren't opening, but that could be my system. So feel free to do that, and we will look forward to some of the follow-up questions from you, and thank you for that as well. So thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and the insights that you brought to us today.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Victoria and Leah, for inviting me, and thanks for all the important and critical work that you're doing. Really was a pleasure to join you today, so thanks.
Thank you. Great. All right.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye. And with that, we're going to move forward on. Oh, you gotta love these platforms. Anyway, but with that, we're going to move forward with our agenda. We thought it was important to touch base. There's been a lot of work that's occurring at the committee level. Some committees are further along than others in their work, but we know that that work is continuing. And we wanted to do a check-in now, kind of an interim to check in with the committee works. We believe there'll be two interim recommendations suggested today, so we'll be taking those up as well. And then at the end of the meeting, we'll be talking a little bit about next steps and how we're going to proceed from here as a plenary group. So we want to begin really by touching base with each of our committees. And we're going to start with our implementation committee. They had a first meeting, you'll hear, to kind of throw out some ideas, and their work is forthcoming. So I'm going to turn this to Charisse Liu and Stu Sims so that they can tell us where they are in their work and where they're headed. So I would turn it to Charisse and to Stu. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Charisse Liu with the Public Justice Center and a committee member. And Stu is also the co-chair of the committee of the Implementation Committee. We have a meeting coming up on the 17th, Wednesday the 17th, with the agenda forthcoming. This meeting coming up, we will be outlining the topics of implementation, hopefully at the scope of our committee, and hopefully at least one or two topics, access and referral, to discuss, and hopefully we'll be having some recommendations or interim recommendations to provide to the committee. Anything else? Stu?
No, I think that's entirely correct. We got some great feedback based on some of the discussions we had. We focused on current notice issues, possible uniformity, and possible intake options based on the programs that we got a quick survey of at the beginning of this process. So we look forward to continuing that discussion on November 17th, and at least one or two more subsequent meetings to that before taking any formalized positions. That's all.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I do believe the committee, Charisse and Stu, are going to be sending out some committee minutes each committee is keeping minutes, and those need to be approved or reviewed by the group, the committee group. So just so you know, those will be coming to you if they haven't, for this committee and the other committees as well, so that we can post those. We just want to make sure that we've captured things accurately before they're posted. And I believe the PowerPoint too, Stu, will be posted as well, that was presented. And just for clarification, the PowerPoint that was posted was really proposed recommendations, as Stu mentioned, based on what we had learned from other jurisdictions, and are not to be thought of as fully baked. There are points of discussion, and the committee is going to move forward to consider the various areas for implementation and what recommendations they want to propose to the full task force. So just for clarification, I think that was asked by Luke, by one of our members, and I wanted to share that with the group. So, all right. Then the next committee we were going to hear from is, and I'm not sure if this is an appropriate time for you, Rena. I know you're in transit. So if you are still in transit and need to land, then we can come back to you and move forward from there. Let's see. I think there's a question from Pam. Pam Newland, did you have a question? You can unmute and ask. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Is there a reason that the committee meetings are not recorded?
There isn't really a meeting. We're not, we really chose, the committees are not a formal part. I mean, we have structured that way to accomplish our work in a very short time frame. Really, frankly, the committees are not legislatively required. So we have not recorded those. It's really just taking notes. There's nothing really, it was a decision because we wanted to allow for full exchange. The committees are staffed by our student fellows, and they're taking notes during those committee proceedings. So it's really an either or. We're recording these meetings because, again, this is the group that is legislatively created, and we've been trying to make sure that we capture everything that's said at the task force meetings themselves. The committee meetings are in a different posture, so we've been using the student fellows to take contemporaneous notes. That's why.
Hi, Vicki, and this is Rena. I am available and not driving, so I can do my report now if that's okay.
Yeah, it's fine with me. We just want you to be safe.
Okay. Just give me a second to toggle to my notes. 1 second. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. No. Okay. You're unmuted. Right. You're fully audible.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I just wanted to give a quick report of the Outreach and Assessment Committee. The committee has identified 3 areas of focus. The title of the committee is Outreach and Assessment, but really there's 3 different topics that we've identified that we need to dig into. One is assessment and evaluation. The second is outreach, and the third is the data that will both support the assessment and evaluation and also the outreach component. This committee has had 3 meetings already. The first was an introductory meeting to sort of understand the scope of the committee and get people's feedback on sort of making sure that we're looking at the right things. And then the subsequent 3 meetings, we haven't had the last one, but the other 2 that we've had have really dug down and sort of looked at each one of these areas. So we've had one on assessment and evaluation. Last week's meeting focused on outreach. And our last meeting of the committee will be this Friday at 10:30, and we'll focus on the data. And we have had participation in the committee from a wide range of stakeholders. We've tried to include people that would bring different perspectives and hold different pieces of information that is important to this committee, including the state and local DHCD, the rental assistance programs, United Way, MMHA, the judiciary, the Attorney General's office, and legal services organizations. Some of the things that are coming out of the committee in terms of, consensus and agreement have been things regarding, things like we do want to get, as we sort of develop this program and as we think about doing an assessment of the program, it is important to make sure that we do get feedback from impacted populations. And this could be through surveys or focus groups, and it may be more qualitative than quantitative, but folks on the committee that agreed that that would be sort of an important thing for us to make sure we keep front and center, is just the experience of the impacted populations and make sure we're designing the system with their feedback. The assessment of the Access to Counsel program itself needs to include different things, including hard outcomes like the reduction in evictions, as well as softer outcomes like, if people get more time to move out. There was also agreement because we looked at sort of different states and how they had looked at outcomes when they were doing their evaluations. And other, some states also looked at granular demographic data, which this committee thought was important in order to be able for us to dig into sort of equity analysis, dealing with gender, race, et cetera. They also thought that there were probably different points that needed assessment, including, assessment of outreach, assessment of the connectivity between different organizations and whether that's working well, assessment of the number of counsel that's necessary to effectuate this program, the effectiveness of counsel itself, and then the effectiveness in reduction of evictions. There is a recommendation that came out of our second committee meeting that is an interim recommendation that I will put forth before this committee. And Vicki, you can tell me whether I should say it now or you want to hold that till later. That interim recommendation does have to do with an RFP related to the assessment and evaluation of this program.
Feel free. You can go ahead and talk about it now, Rita. There's no downside to that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful. So the committee agreed. We had understood from the fundraising committee meeting that there were some funds that were more time sensitive and had a lifespan that was shorter, and there was discussion about whether those funds should be used for infrastructure development, because there is a lot of infrastructure, as we know, that needs to be built even before we get to the actual implementation of the program. And part of that infrastructure also has to do with data and assessment. And obviously, it's hard to assess a program that does not exist. However, in looking at the RFPs of other states that had done something similar, and in talking to MLSC, who would be the entity that puts out the RFP, there was an understanding that we could structure the RFP in a way that we can get to work on sort of establishing a baseline data and whatever data sharing agreements and other things that we need to really start getting a sense of where we are. And so the RFP can be structured in a way that we can start on some of the infrastructure development, use some of the funds that we have existing for that infrastructure development, while also putting other stuff in the RFP, including assessment of the actual program as contingent on future funding. And so the committee, there was agreement that this would be a good use of funds because we did need to make sure there was assessment and we need to make sure there was data. That if there was time sensitivity, which there is with the MLSC existing funds, that we could make a recommendation for MLSC to put out the RFP at its earliest opportunity. So I'm just going to read the actual text of what the recommendation would be that this committee, that this group could look at. So the recommendation from the Outreach and Assessment Committee is that the task force recommends that the Maryland Legal Services Corporation put out a request for proposal at the earliest opportunity so that time-sensitive funds MLSC has already received can be used to develop the data and evaluation infrastructure necessary to implement the Access to Counsel in Evictions program. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions in relation to that.
There is a question, although the question is, I think is not really germane to the RFP, to the recommendation that was from Luke. So that's a little backward. Maybe Luke, I know you have a question for Rena. So it's just an order. I think it came in while you were talking about the RFP. So it related to your presentation. So I'm going to pause for a minute. Why don't we just take up Luke's question so it's not hanging out there, and then we'll circle back to the recommendation. So Luke asks, when failure to pay rent evictions are delayed, the delay increases the total balance due. How does the outreach committee balance that negative outcome for tenants when using delayed evictions as an assessment metric? Do you want to answer that, Rena, or I can answer otherwise if you're. I think it was referred to in your report back.
Yeah, I don't think I clearly understand what the question is. Vicki, if you want to start taking a stab at it, and then I'll come back. But I don't think I completely understood the question.
I think it came up during outcomes. If, an eviction delay, how do you characterize a delay in eviction? Whether that's a part of a positive outcome for a tenant or not. And I think it was seen as a positive outcome, or perhaps perceived that was part of the reporting out from the committee. And I think Luke's questioning, how can that be considered an outcome, a desirable outcome, when actually the delay can cause the tenant to owe more? If I've fairly characterized that. Is that right, Luke? Did I get that correctly? I think what the committee was looking at, as far as what are the positive outcomes, how do you describe the positive? Okay, so Luke says yes, I got that. Characterize it, but how is that viewed as a positive if it's increasing the total balance? And I think this is going to be an issue. This actually goes squarely into the RFP and why. So I'm going to pivot a little here, because I think this is why an RFP is necessary, because it's really about characterizing and assess, what is the appropriate assessment? How do we know what success looks like in an access to counsel program? That's why it's critical to get that work started, because it is complicated. It isn't, one thing may be positive, so the person isn't evicted, but is that truly a positive if they have greater liability? I think that's what Luke is asking. And I think having someone, I'm at an academic institution, and it's really critical that you begin at the beginning with an assessment. It seems somewhat counterintuitive, but you want to go into a program understanding what are the outcomes you're looking at, what's a positive, what's a negative, how do we look at that, and how do we track those outcomes as we go along. I don't think it's hard-baked at the moment, Luke. I think that's part of having an independent third party really looking at what your possible outcomes are going to be and how do you measure that from the beginning, because you want to be able to ask the right questions as you go along. So I'm pivoting, I guess, to the RFP itself. Pam, did you have a comment? I see your hands up.
I have a question, Vicki.
Sure, please.
Should those who are going to be providing services under this program be involved in developing that RFP? Or should it be broader? Should more people be involved in that?
Well, MLSC is the one. I get Deb. Do you want to answer that question, because you're the one
Sure.
implementing the program?
We are the statutory administrator of the program. We will not be providing the legal services ourselves. So we are a grant making organization. We don't provide direct services. So in the RFP or in the statute, it calls for assessment and for us to administer the program, including the funding that can be used for assessment.
Right, but Public Justice and Legal Aid do, correct?
But they're not going to be administering the program. They could receive funding under it, but MLSC would develop the RFP. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Who would be actually developing? Yeah, and I think we have samples from other states, what they have used.
Connecticut had a good model, as I recall.
Can you share those?
Those are
I think the Connecticut one is already in there, but I don't know if we actually received the hard copy Washington one. they had a relationship with one of their universities as well that they discussed, but I'm sure we can find them if we don't have them yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, we definitely have the Connecticut one, and it was shared with the committee and is in the task force documents. And we've reached out to Washington, and we were actually trying to get them, to come back and speak to us and follow up. But they're also really busy setting up their program. So we'll reach back out to see if there's any documents that they can provide. But as of yet, I don't think we have any from Washington.
And I think, again, just looking at what our role is really not to develop the RFP in the task force, but rather, I think what we're saying is that we think an RFP should be issued now, that you should start to develop that now and issue it and use some of the funds that MLSC has on hand that are time sensitive to get that started. Because that will, to your point, Luke and Pam, be the opportunity to ask those questions. What are the right metrics? What should we be doing? And it's very helpful to have a third party engaged in that assessment. It gives you a different perspective on that. So I think that's what's before us really, is to get that going sooner. That's a sooner than later. These interim recommendations really have a purpose so that we can get the work started, because issuing an RFP now with some time limited money funds would be useful to begin the process of setting up a program. That's what I believe the recommendation lays out. Pam, did you have another follow-up? Your hand's up again. I don't want to miss you if you had another question.
No, I think it's just up from the last.
Okay.
Last
All
question.
right.
Thank you.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay. So that's that's one of them. Why don't we move on to the funding report, and then we'll take up these two interim recommendations that are in the again on the Google Drive for your consideration. Yes, please, Deb. Is that, Rena?
Vicki, sorry, this is, can I just finish my report? So that was the assessment and evaluation part, but I just have a few more things that we discussed in the outreach committee that I just wanted to share with the group.
Absolutely.
Quickly.
Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. Go right ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. Okay, so on the outreach side, there was a good discussion. There's, in terms of what the committee is thinking, that there should be every attempt to reach people as early as possible to connect them to counsel at the pre-filing stage. There's agreement about that. Awareness, about access to counsel should be raised well in advance. And, the understanding that what problems people may have are legal problems, that connection could be made, even before people get ensnared in the system. And then there are different touch points that people, we could use as sort of the points at which we start, connecting people, including, for example, the notice that we've talked about before. There was a lot of discussion about coordination among state and local entities in relation to outreach, because both have been doing it separately for the rental assistance. And so we should look for greater coordination for the access to counsel. There should be data sharing among the different stakeholders that hold key information, and also that this is something that has come out of the meetings, and is very apparent that when there is information sharing and relationship building between the key stakeholders to get connected to counsel, that effectuates sort of the ability for someone to get counsel, and also make sure that if they're receiving rental assistance, that they also do not receive a judgment. So that kind of relationship building and between key stakeholders is key to success. There should be a centralized call number. So we had a discussion about what works best. Should local folks direct people to their local entities? Should there be something centralized? But I think there was discussion about it's very helpful to have one number to advertise, but then what on the back end, that there should be sort of local jurisdictions that are connected immediately, and there's no lag, because each jurisdiction has sort of a different time frame as to when the rent court cases come up. Some could be weeks, and others are like the next day. So that's very important for us to be mindful of on the back end. and that we really need to ensure key partner organizations, including faith leaders, continuum of care groups, other social service providers are aware of the Access to Counsel program, because they will be the ones mostly doing the referrals as they see other people in other sort of related and adjacent situations that could use help. Also, there should be a centralized website with this information. And there are some things, other things that could be developed in a centralized way, including outreach messages, but that dissemination would happen through local trusted partners. Attaching existing, of course, we would want to attach to existing efforts that are getting the word out about the rental assistance, but make sure that we are very clear in our messaging about counsel, and that we need to be mindful and have multimodal strategies that include digital, but also have a ground and paper game for the areas where people face technological challenges, and that the lack of a real-time eviction database it provides a challenge, and so that should be rectified. So sorry, Vicki, so that was my complete report, and I'll hand it back over to you.
No apologies. That was a very thorough report and great information, great work by the committee to pull all that together. So thank you, Rena. I think that has been a challenge. I think Luke raised it with our speaker, and how do we get to folks early? That is a big challenge. How do we get their attention? How do we get them connected to resources and avoid that day of court, or get them hooked up with counsel as needed prior to the day of court? So that's great. Thank you. Thanks very much. Any questions for Rena or for that committee at this point? Okay. All right. Well, we're going to move then to our last committee report, which is from Deb Seltzer, who's chairing our funding committee.
Right. So the funding committee has had one meeting. We are currently in the process of both approving the minutes from that meeting and scheduling our next meeting. But at the first meeting, we kind of set the stage and talked about some of the funding that has been referenced that MLSC has already. We do have some emergency one-time funding that is available for infrastructure needs, because we have already deployed several $million of that to fund eviction prevention grants for the current fiscal year, FY22. So the remaining funds, potential uses might include this kind of intake system that we're discussing, the assessment piece, hiring a project manager. We're looking at, is there a potential for some kind of pipeline of fellowships or attorneys, because we know that hiring is very difficult right now. So we're looking at really those base infrastructure needs that have kind of one-time setup costs that these funds could be directed toward pretty quickly. So we also reviewed great information compiled by Alexa, our law student research assistant. She looked at other jurisdictions and specifically how they were funding either right to counsel programs or intensive eviction prevention legal services, regardless of whether or not there was a statutory right. There are a few different sources out there, but the vast majority of those jurisdictions at this moment, because it's available, are using federal funding. So we know that there are several sources of federal funding that are applicable to access to counsel, to eviction prevention, some of which Rachel, our guest speaker, mentioned earlier. Two that we specifically know of: up to 10% of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which you may have heard called ERAP, up to 10% of that can be used for housing stability, which includes legal services. There are also much more broad state fiscal recovery funds, which really can be used to address kind of anything related to the pandemic or any economic impacts, whether they are long-term or short-term. And we know, obviously, the pandemic has affected evictions in multiple ways. So the deadlines for the use of those funds generally align with the implementation goals that is in the statute. We also know that the one-time funding that MLSC has will not be available after this year to kind of sustain just the portion of legal services that are ongoing. So we also had an initial recommendation that I will read, and it's that the funding committee recommends the task force make an early request in advance of the January 1st task force report to pursue federal funding for short-term objectives. This initial recommendation must be made quickly as the state finalizes plans for federal funds. Current eviction prevention work cannot be sustained into next year because the funding available this year is one time. The federal funds have deadlines for use that generally match. So as you may know, the state is working on their budget for fiscal year 23, which would start July 1, 2022 to June 30, 2023. So that's the year we're looking at. So also included in the materials were a letter that I drafted that could be used to make this request to encourage the governor to put federal funds in. So we know the governor has received several, obviously there's a lot of competition for these funds. We know there are many uses out there. So we specifically laid out that both ERAP 2 and those fiscal recovery funds could be used, and that those would be the funds that we recommend being available to jumpstart the program. At the funding committee meeting, we did not discuss amounts or programs because we know that the implementation committee and outreach committee are still doing their work. When I put together this letter, I felt it would be helpful to lay out an example of what could be requested. So, and I will explain how we got to these numbers. I recommended in this letter that about $12 million of those federal funds, which is a very small portion of those very large federal funds, be available. And the reason for that being that we don't think we're kind of kickstarting the program in terms of the legal services this year. We know we have bridge funding until the end of FY22, but we've kind of already missed the opportunity for funding to go into the dedicated access to counsel in evictions special fund that was created by the legislation that also created this task force. So looking at some estimations based on things that our legal services grantees have reported to us on costs and projected number of cases kind of available per attorney. We know that attorneys, should focus their time on the extended representation cases that will, involve going to court. These could be day of cases, as we have talked about in various committees, but they could also be cases like the breach of lease and tenant holding over that have, more extended time periods. We know that the attorneys will also manage some kind of brief advice questions that, folks may call and ask questions. Eventually, perhaps that would be transitioned to more of an intake center or something like that. But for this beginning, we know that individual attorneys will both be handling those kind of long-term extended representation cases and the brief cases that some may take less than half an hour, some may take a few hours, depending on the level of the case. There's a wide range of services that's going to go anywhere from that brief advice to negotiation to full representation in litigation. That would also include representation in the administrative proceedings related to termination of rental subsidies, which is also included in the law. Those tend to be kind of two-part cases. They have both an eviction hearing and an administrative hearing related to the subsidy. So those are kind of especially time intensive. So we know that, so we have this kind of what we can come up to of what the providers have projected would cost kind of per case based on this mix of extended representation and the brief services that they'll fit in there. And when looking at the Stout report that was prepared for Baltimore City, they were able to kind of do some estimations on the number of cases that are not default judgments, the number of cases that are actually eligible for representation because there is an income eligibility and a kind of case type eligibility built into the statute that they took into account many of. So eventually, if the Stout report is extrapolated to the whole state, we're looking at least kind of 35,000 cases per year. We know that's not doable in year one. Oh, and I'm sorry, that's just for the full representation cases. So plus an equal or slightly lower amount of the brief advice cases. We know that's not doable in year one. We also know that eviction filings are still at somewhere around 50% of pre-pandemic levels. So taking into account that we both need to phase in over time, and that kind of concurrently, the eviction filings are still lower, and we don't know how quickly they will rise or won't. If we start in this first full year in fiscal year 23, if we start at 67 staff attorneys, and then plus the incorporated supervising attorneys, paralegals, administrative assistants that they need, and then the other legal services costs, the legal services costs would come to about $10 million. And then I also put in the request for the outreach education assessment that is required, and we have some funding to jumpstart those infrastructure investments, but I believe additional ongoing costs will be needed for, an intake system, a database, that kind of thing. So that's how I put together the letter. So the funding committee's recommendation is to put in a request for federal funds, and then that's how I developed the full letter. Luke says if we're using Baltimore as a guide for the full state, doesn't that ignore? So yes and no, because we know some things in Baltimore will happen more frequently in other places and less frequently in others. Because it's the number that has, or the location that has already been studied, that's the guideline that we have to go on. I also think we should be clear that we will be kind of constantly assessing. We will have both the external assessment that will go from this RFP, but we'll also have the task force that will be doing assessment of kind of needs and performance as time goes on, because there could also be other changes that will affect eviction rates, that will affect filing rates, that will affect how many cases are dismissed before they even get to trial. There are a lot of moving pieces right now, so we know that this is going to be something that needs to be adjusted as we go.
All right, I do believe Pam had a question as well. That's right, it's a bit of a moving target because we're basing it on how the eviction filings went pre-pandemic, and we don't have, and that was before the 10-day notice and some other things. We don't know what the impacts will be, so we're trying to stand up the program while we will continually have to evaluate whether we've gotten the assumptions correct. Pam?
Thank you. Deb, who provided information other than obviously the Stout report? You said that you gathered information.
So we every year when we do a grant making process, we collect information on budgets, on projected number of cases. So that's all information provided to us by the providers when they apply for funding. So it's a wide range of providers who are doing eviction work. And this was kind of an average across all of those providers, and I should say it also includes those who are including pro bono work, like Rachel talked about earlier, and the importance of that. So we're kind of averaging that across to make an average cost per case, but obviously each individual case has a lot of variation.
Okay, so can you provide that data to us?
Of who, of
the
eviction providers?
The numbers, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you how I got to it, that, our eviction providers estimated using about 15.48 FTE attorneys. That's what you're talking about, Pam?
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all data that we collect from our grantees every year.
Right, but what I'm asking is, I'd like to see the full package of how you arrived at these numbers. You're 100% right that we said no one had an objection to using federal funds, but I was a little surprised, actually a little taken aback to receive this information just 5 hours ago that had these huge numbers in them. I'd like to see all the data, if you wouldn't mind, as to how the numbers were put together.
Sure.
And Pam, if you recall, I just want to say, Pam, if you remember, there actually is another letter in there that talked about some of the assumptions, a fulsome letter that was sent to the governor, and it's part of our materials that gave some pretty specific. It was a much bigger number. It was like 64 million, over the course of years. But just so you know, for reference also, just to kind of have a sense of the fact that we knew that this was not going to be an insignificant number. But yeah, please go ahead, Deb. I think you can answer the question.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I can provide those. It's as I said, numbers that the grantees provide to us every year.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Luke, you have your hand up?
Yeah, this kind of goes along with what Pam was asking about, and maybe the methodology will answer the question. I'm not as familiar with sort of the legal services community. Would the sort of the funding request help bring like the caseload level to parity with like other, like areas where legal services are provided to every defendant? Like, are we like matching it 1-to-1? Is that?
No, so
Okay.
MLSC only funds civil legal services first, and there is really no other legal process like eviction in Maryland. So there is really no comparison on that front, if that's what you're talking about. Are you talking about in terms of like caseloads and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm just sort of curious how how do you even gauge it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so every year we ask the providers to kind of make projections based on their past experience, based on any expansion plans they have, based on, changes that they have seen in the legal system. So for example, in this one grant program, we asked this for some eviction providers. Aggregated, they were looking at, something like between 15 and 16 attorneys, averaging around 260 cases per attorneys, which is a mix of that full rep and brief advice. And that averages out to be a little under $600 a case. Again, widely varying within those cases, because those brief advice cases may take 15 or 30 minutes, whereas the other cases could take days, and involve postponements and multiple trials and that kind of thing.
Gotcha. And how would that compare to in criminal cases, you would be able to get an attorney if you can't afford one? Like, would it? How? I guess I guess you're saying that the caseload metric doesn't really match up the right way. Like, what are?
Right, because in criminal cases, they're generally if you are assigned a public defender, they don't have the option of giving you 15 minutes of advice, and then.
Okay.
Right. They're doing full representation the whole time.
Gotcha. Okay. That's just my misunderstanding. Okay.
Yeah, and it goes back to the ethical obligation, as you know, of lawyers, that once you take that case, you have to take the case, regardless of what's required for representation. So it's also kind of bound up with that duty of the lawyer who's taking the case, which makes it variable as a result. Pam, did you have a question as well?
I do, please. So here at Henderson Webb, when we do our budgets, we have to deal with the actual numbers, and then we do our projections, obviously, from there. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming you're doing something similar. You're taking the actual numbers and then working your way into the projections.
Yeah. So the projections, now remember, are made for a year in which nobody quite knew what the word operations were going to be. Right? Nobody knew what the rate of resumption of evictions hearings would be. Even as they have continued, some of the jurisdictions have, social distancing in place, so they're not hearing as many cases. So the grantees kind of took their best professional judgment based on past experience and based on what they anticipated happening this fiscal year, and that's how we make the projections.
So do you have numbers, let's say, from 2019? That they can provide?
So we didn't fully fund this program in 2019. We didn't have a dedicated program. We just stood one up in 2019 for less than $1 million. It was not kind of at this level. And part of 2019 for them was spent kind of hiring and doing upworks. But in 2019, just for our eviction specific grants, they did about 750 cases with about 5 FTEs, or a little more than 5 FTEs. So that was kind of launch year. And then in FY20, however, the last quarter of FY20 was affected by the pandemic, it jumped to 1,200 cases and 6 FTEs. So that's the problem that we're facing, is that the time period that we have run this specific grant program is concurrent with the pandemic. So it's not really a normal number, because we don't know what normal is yet.
Okay, thank you.
Jessica?
Thanks, Deb. I was actually surprised the number seemed low to me, given the amount of need that we're anticipating. Is there a way to project out at this point? And I'm guessing the answer is no, because of the limitations on services that have been available in the past. But is that something that you thought about and considered in terms of the need being much greater than?
Sure. So I think
providers?
as we see over the next few months, as the court can continue to release data on what eviction filings look like, we will have a better sense, because the data we have now includes much of the moratoriums, and then the extension and then cancel, that kind of thing. So that's why now we also want to recognize the legal services providers will not be able to hire 60 attorneys overnight, right? We know that will take a process and a ramp up time. So that's kind of why I thought this was a starting point, as opposed to what the ultimate cost will be. Because again, I think there will be things that will drive costs up over time, as the demand increases and the providers can ramp up, but potentially also things that will drive the costs lower over time, when the full impact of the notice is known. If there are other legislative changes right now, the rental assistance that is available is still having an impact, obviously, but we know that won't last forever. So again, this is going to have to be one of those assess as we go along, because we just don't know what the status of the program is going to be.
I think the idea of putting forth a recommendation right now was so that it can get started. The time, the clock is running out, as we know. I think perhaps most of our task force members know. The budgets are being developed now, the decisions are being made now, and we don't want to miss the window. I think that was the concern, is that at least for now, not that it won't involve some assessment and some review as we go along to see how the numbers do bear out. I think that will be part of the work of the task force, and certainly MLSC is steeped in that work on a daily basis, trying to figure out what the need is and how to manage that. But we'll have a chance to review or whatever. But I think there was some concern that if we waited till January 1st to make a request, that we would miss the mark. We would miss the opportunity, we would have missed the window, because this is the time in which the governor is developing his budget. And so we didn't want to miss that opportunity, and that's why it's being presented right now to the task force as an interim recommendation, something that we would ask right now. So we have two, I'm going to move to that. We have two recommendations before us. One is this, what we've been discussing right now, which is the funding recommendation, which would involve a request to the governor, really talking about what Deb has proposed, that this is the assessment at the moment based on certain assumptions. I think you have the letter in the Google Drive that says, the assumptions that Deb talked about. And then we'll have to see, but asking the governor right now to please include money for access to counsel and evictions special fund. Right now, the access to counsel and evictions special fund has no money in it. That's not going to work. So we know that's true. And I think there's been some analysis trying to embed it based on experience, and also, MLSC has a long history of funding legal services. So really based on their expertise, as well as looking at this report and making some assumptions, some predictions and assumptions. And we'll see, as a task force, we'll have an opportunity to see whether we got that right. But right now, there's some urgency in the request itself. So I'm bringing this one as well as the other request, which is basically to issue an RFP, and that will be to MLSC, and Deb is right here. So she'll hear that from us. We'll transmit that to her. But the other one does require a letter to the governor to make this request. So I'm really wanted to talk to us. Pam, did you put your hand up again? I'm never sure whether it's a legacy or I don't want to miss you.
I'm sorry.
No.
So many questions. I apologize, but
that's all right. No, that's why we're here. You're welcome to ask questions. Absolutely.
I would really like to see these numbers, how Deb arrived at these numbers. And I know you say that it's in a letter, but the projections and whatnot, I do not believe are there. So I'd really like to see this data before.
Well, that's a bit of a startling assumption, I would say, Pam. I understand you want to see the numbers. I think Deb's gone through it. Do you want her to go through that once more? Would that be helpful for you, or what is it that would allay your concern?
Well, when you're dealing with these kind of numbers, I think it's very important to see it in writing. I think it's very important that we all have the opportunity to digest what's going on here, and we'd like to see the package. You know, what exactly is, how did you arrive specifically at these numbers? And you're talking about projections, you're talking about the fact that you didn't have any real hard data for 20 or 21, which I understand completely because of the pandemic. But I think that it's really important to see this data.
Okay, because if you look at the cost breakdown, so let's just take a moment to review. I think that's useful, and then we can see what the assumptions are in that. So if we take a peek at that, looking at the letter, looking at the attachment, in the cost breakdown, it's legal services personnel costs. So 67 staff attorneys, 9 supervising attorneys. Chances are they're going to be newer attorneys, potentially. We don't know that, but that's possible. And then 17 paralegals and the fringe benefits associated with that. So that's $8.2 million. That's the bulk of the cost, as it always is. It's personnel, really. I mean, when you're talking about providing access to counsel, it's paying for counsel. So that's the key cost of this. The other costs are for equipment, research, training, insurance. You have to have malpractice insurance for these folks, translation costs. That's estimated at $1.7 million. And then the outreach and education, which we were talking about earlier, $1.3 million, letting people know, both contracts with community groups, which is, as you recall, is part of the statute, MLSC is required to fund some outreach for this program. That's part of their statutory obligation. So just doing those costs are $1.3 million. And then lastly, $500,000 for infrastructure, which is the databases, the intake systems, the administrative costs that are involved in just having those employees and having this program up and running. That's really how they got to the 11.8, to be specific. It's 11.8, so it's less than we thought. $1 million. It was a rounding, $200,000 rounded up.
I understand that the figures are very clearly stated on this page, but that's the conclusion. That's the end result of the data that Deb, I assume, put together through these numbers that she's been given. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't know, I don't see anything that shows me how she got to 67 attorneys or the caseloads or anything else like that. And that's the information I'm looking for. I understand the data that she's provided. It's very clear, but I don't understand the backup for it.
Deb, could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly write it out, but I can also read it to you of that when the grantees made projections on their cases, they projected using 15.4 FTE attorneys. This is just to develop a cost per case. That includes all in that. And so let me say that includes the supervising, that includes the non-personnel cost, that includes the paralegal support. But using a cost per direct service attorney is how I arrived at this. That could do an estimated 264 cases each, or per FTE, which is a mix of extended representation and brief service. So that brings the average cost to about 558 or 578. I can pull that, which brings the cost, if we're looking at phasing in over time based on the Stout report. So let me say this, the cost numbers come from the grantees. The estimated case numbers come from extrapolating from the Stout report that, you know, 60%, 63% of cases will default, that there are a certain number of tenants who will not accept representation even if it's offered to them. There are a certain number of tenants that are not eligible based on their income. And so that's where that the case number came from.
And hearing 264 cases per attorney, I mean, that seems like a very light load compared to the public defender's office, the standard in district court, or it just seems like an extremely light load.
It's higher than what Washington has called for in their state implementation plan. That is not high.
Not a light load.
Given the number of cases that our grantees provide in other service areas, that does not appear to be an unusual number. Remember that this is a mix of cases where they are doing full representation that may span across multiple days and the more brief service.
I understand. I appreciate what you're saying. I'm comparing it to the 700 cases that an attorney is handling in district court. What's the mix of cases? How did you develop the numbers based on the number of breach of leases versus rent cases versus tenant holding over?
So I don't have a breakdown of that per case. I solely stuck with extended representation, which would include any time an attorney is up in court versus brief advice where they're just doing more brief service, counseling, advice, that kind of thing. We don't have a breakdown. We do know that the number of tenant holding over and breach of lease cases have, though they're a small proportion, they have increased over the last year. But there is also not kind of a statutory breakdown of what level needs to be provided for each case. So I don't have a breakdown of that.
Okay. Luke, did you have a hand up? 264 cases per year in a state where 95% of cases that are failure to pay rent would make 250 cases that are relatively straightforward and 14 more tricky cases. Well, that's an assumption you're making, Luke. I think there's assumptions here.
The district court provided that data, so I'm using that as like my guidepost. And I understand, like, I'm not an attorney. I'm not sure what the appropriate caseload is, but failure to pay rent cases, like there are not a lot of things to cover. I know there are certain things.
Not all of the failure to pay rent cases end on the same day. There are some that get postponements for various reasons. There are some that need defenses raised because it is not just about the, rent case. That's why this assumption builds into all those cases that are default judgments already, because the tenants who show up to court potentially are there because they have a defense to raise. They just don't know how to do it.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, Charisse.
Hi, thank you. I'm not sure, maybe I'm a little lost in the line of questionings, but we are very aware of how much work goes into each case and the type of case. For instance, I just did a failure to pay rent case where I had to go over 7 years of a ledger, which took 8 hours and more days just to get the ledger itself. So I'm not sure. Are we discussing whether we know our caseload, or I'm not sure what is the appropriate caseload, because we are currently representing more than 8 hours of work per day. So I'm not sure what will we be introducing, the amount of hours that we should be working or the amount of cases that we should be working. I'm not sure where that number would be satisfactory to people who aren't doing it.
Pam?
Charisse, this isn't a question of how many cases I do or don't think the attorney should be handling. It's a question of will public justice provide data on how many cases they manage each year and how many attorneys are handling those cases? That could probably put things in perspective for us.
So then those numbers are included in Deb's numbers, in Deb Seltzer's numbers. That's what we all have to do each year. Now, right, this year it's a little different or I should say 2020 was a little bit different, not lighter in any way, more time on each case because of the federal laws that came down, the governor's laws, the governor's mandate, things like that, the stopping of court, the continuation of court. But I'm not sure what would be the appropriate or satisfying number for what we do, especially when the filings are so high and we are trying to represent as many as we can.
It's not a question of a satisfying number. It's a question that I've asked 3 times now. I've asked repeatedly for this information. How many cases are being handled by each of the agencies? And if you can't break down the types of cases, I somewhat understand that. And I'd like to know how many attorneys are handling the cases. I don't think it's a unreasonable request to ask this information.
Deb, is that information that you could provide?
So I can provide it to some extent, right? Because I can only provide it for the small eviction specific grant program that we fund. I cannot provide it for example, work that Baltimore City is funding right now. I don't have that data. I don't collect that data broken out. I may get an aggregate number of cases from providers, but that's not something MLSC collects on a broad scale. What I have is the numbers that I used, which are based on our eviction specific program, because that's what we fund.
And I guess that wouldn't include, so that's some of the CARES Act money, some of the county money, some of the LSC funding so you won't have
right.
That
so those
data.
Numbers that I shared when there were 750 cases and 1,100 cases, like those were just with MLSC funding, not with all of the other fund. And I should say just with MLSC eviction specific funding, whereas we know some of the providers are using our funding for general legal services, which would include eviction prevention, that are reported separately. So I only have, the only eviction specific data I can give is what's funded under this small grant program, as opposed to our more than $20 million of total grant making every year, because that's more broad. We don't collect the data on a granular level for that.
So Pam, I think this goes to one of the main issues. I think we can all agree that, the data collection in the eviction context is inadequate. I think that's a recommendation. I think we can all come around that there is not sufficient data currently. I think we're going to be able to say that pretty forcefully in our report, that we're not getting the sufficient data from the courts, certainly about eviction filings. We don't have sufficient data now on the provision of services because it's really a hodgepodge. If we stand up this program and we have an access to counsel special fund dedicated to this, we'll have insights that we do not have now about what's required for eviction prevention and how can we assess it. I think we are working in an imperfect environment right now. This is really challenging because we've never done anything like this, so we don't have a comparator. That's why we looked at Washington and looked at some other issues to see if we could get some kind of guidepost as to how to fund this program. I think we're making some assumptions. We don't know if all of our assumptions are accurate, so I want to be clear about that. I don't think any one of us can say with absolute certainty that this is the right number and this is the right provision of services, that 67 attorneys is going to do the trick and is going to be sufficient to meet the need, or could be excessive for the need, in which case we'll be able to revise our assessment going forward to say, that was either too much, too little, we didn't hit it right, and getting the data is going to be so critical for us. That's why this is going to be kind of key to our enterprise to be able to assess this program.
Vicki, this is Rena. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to also point out that, I hear the need and I also feel the urgency in terms of the timing. We know that there's a surplus right now. We know that the governor is, this is the time when there is a large surplus to stand up a big program. What they need is big ideas, and for us to present them with a way that we can use this money. Trusted organizations like MLSC can sort of get this money out. And as you're saying, I really understand, Pam and Luke, your concern about is this the right number or not. But I would also like to highlight that, this is a scaled program and there's 3 or 4 more years that we have to get to full. And this is by no means, one, we don't meet the need as it is. So whatever need exists, the legal services organizations are not meeting that need. And we are trying to pivot to a program where we are trying to get away from, hey, we'll triage, we'll give you a little bit, to everyone should have access to counsel, right? And so I think if there is this recognition that we don't have complete data, and there's recognition that, if there's any changes, if we set up this infrastructure for assessment and we monitor that, we can really have good data moving forward. But as a starting point, especially if we're combining 2 different years of this program that we're just collapsing together, and we know we're already not meeting the need, we know that this is going to be scaled over 4 to 5 years, and so we're not going to reach a point where, it's too much, then there is a budget surplus. I mean, I do think this is the time to act. I think this task force can recognize we don't have complete data. We can recognize that we're working off of incomplete information, but we can also recognize that this is in no way meeting the complete need to fulfill this access to counsel program. And if we're combining 2 different years and we're coming up with 12 million, I think it is a very reasonable amount. And we take these assumptions forward and we commit to assessing as we move forward.
Okay. I think that, those are good points. I would like to move forward. I see we're at 5:42. I know we're beyond the time that we'd allocated for our task force meeting. And I wanted to be able to bring these forward to the group. And I would like to get a sense of the group at this time. And when I'm talking about the group, I do mean the task force members. So those of you who are joining us to listen in, we appreciate your being here and your interest. Absolutely, you're welcome to be part of the proceedings and listen. But I would ask that you don't weigh in on the recommendations. That's the work of the task force. So in terms of the recommendations themselves, I would ask, are there objections to going forward with these 2 interim recommendations? So I'm going to ask the first one, which is the RFP. Does anybody have an objection from the task force, please, to recommending that an RFP be developed and issued by MLSC for this program? So let's start with that one. Task force members, if you have any objection, I'd like you to raise it now. Okay. Seeing no objections, then I would say that we would, Luke, did you have a hand up? Please do. Yeah.
Yes, so was this for the MLSC RFP letter?
This is for the MLS, this is for the RFP. So this is urging MLSC, who's sitting here with us, in the form of Deb, to issue an RFP so that we can begin really the process of assessment that we've been talking about. How are we going to judge this program? So this one I'm proffering first of the 2. That would be really urging MLSC to use its money to do this. No objection then, Luke? Okay. Any other persons wanting to object to that? Seeing none, then we would say yes. That's a recommendation of the task force that we would encourage MLSC to use some of its one-time money to stand up an RFP. And certainly I know Deb is open to suggestions. You have the Connecticut RFP, or if we get the Washington RFP, we'll definitely put that in the Google Drive. So you can all take a look and provide to MLSC any of your comments or considerations for the RFP. And Deb will keep us posted, right, about the issuance of that. Great. Thank you so much. Okay, now we're going to the other one, which I didn't think has a little more meat and controversy to it, but we wanted to look at the other recommendation, which is asking the governor to provide federal funds, to provide some of the money that they have on hand now in its next budget, basically in FY23, because those budgets are being developed right now, for the access to counsel and evictions program, and that money be put, the $12 million be put in the Access to Counsel and Eviction Special Fund. And so that's what we're considering now. And I'd like it to hear those who might raise objections to that. If you have any objection to such a recommendation, which would include the issuance of a letter to the governor, please do unmute and so state. I see Pam and Luke both have their hands up. Please do feel free to speak. Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we are okay with the federal money, as I stated, Deb, during the meeting that you held. But I have to have transparent and thorough data. And I have asked repeatedly for data, and I have been given I've been given information that doesn't answer my questions. I'm not referring to you, Deb. I'm referring to the prior meetings. So I could not vote for this. I'm sorry.
Okay, I think I would just say in their defense, I understand what you're asking, and we'll definitely make a notation. I want to make sure as we move forward with recommendations where we do have some concerns raised by members of the task force, we will so note that. I don't want this to reflect anything other than the true representation of our discussions. So I would say, I think, Pam, in response, if I may, I think that the data you're asking for just doesn't fully exist. You know, what some of the assumptions that are being made because we don't have such a program and we don't have all the information that you're asking for. But we will note to see if we can find from providers more. We asked for that information, as you recall, from DHCD. We asked for them to provide some of that. We haven't received that information yet about what exactly was being funded for legal services. We certainly know that they've put a lot of money into eviction prevention, but we don't have the breakdown by county. And because it's such an alphabet soup, I don't think we have all of that, but we're going to attempt to get that because that's very real, Pam. We do want to know what resources are being put toward legal services currently. That's part of our charge.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much. And Luke, you wanted to speak as well?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Pam, like I do like the idea of, you know, requesting federal funds. I think it's important to get this stuff in the budget early. Like I understand budget cycles. I think a problem that I'm having, and it sounds like Pam is also having, is just the way we're arriving at the figures doesn't quite sort of pass the very quick smell test. It might over time like make sense, and I'm just not as familiar with these particular numbers as others might be. I'd like to review the methodology a bit more, and I think, you know, like I think ultimately the letter to the governor makes sense, but I wouldn't be willing to sort of sign on to this particular one.
Okay, we want to make sure that we note that both Pam and Luke have concerns. While they support the concept, they have concerns about the dollar figure. Is that accurate? Did I characterize that accurately? Because we want to make sure we're noting objections as they come.
Yes, that is characterized accurately, and we're going to be sending our own letter to the governor.
Okay, that's fair enough. We, you know, everyone is free to do as they wish. We have to act as a task force, and we will continue to do so. But we know that folks have different perspectives on these issues. Luke, did you have another issue you wanted to raise?
Nope, I just left my hand up. Sorry.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure, especially when we're taking an action like that. I don't want to be remiss and not give people an opportunity to be heard. Okay, so I think as we see, we have two of our members of our task force who have noted concerns and would not be in support of the recommendation because they are concerned about the methodology and the dollar figure, though they support the concept. I believe Natalie left, but she also supported both of the recommendations, so we can so note that. All right, well, we're going to move forward then with this. The last item on the agenda is really our next meeting. So our next meeting, I know everybody's so busy, and we wanted to put that out there for your consideration. So when we come together next, we really will need to spend some time together. And that is I wanted to just raise it. We're looking at that week of December 6th, because I think by then all the committees will have finished their work. It would probably be the latter part of the week, just so we want to make sure that the task force members have a chance to look at the recommendations prior to coming together and considering them. So we want to make sure you have some time. We don't want to have you considering them and reading them at the same time. That's not good. So probably the latter part of that week of December 6th, so maybe the Wednesday or Thursday. And what I wanted to raise with you is your appetite and your interest in coming together in person. I know, we're in COVID. It's a bizarre time. Ideally, I think it would be good to come together in person, because I think it's easier to discuss these things. You can have more robust discussions in person than you can on a screen. But I'm not pressing the point. I just wanted to raise it with the group to see whether you were interested in meeting in person. And you can speak now if you wish. I think we're going to send out some, we hate them, but we need them, doodle poll of some sort to get a sense of when you're available. But if you have any thoughts about that, either objections to being in person, and I know it's a sensitive subject during COVID. I don't know if anybody had a
I think it's a great idea to meet in person.
Okay. All right. One in favor. I'm in favor as well. We might be able to do it in the law school. I don't know yet. We can see about the venue if it's possible. Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll just ask you the question when we send out, the doodle for that. But I would guess that somebody just said I'm in favor. Luke, okay. I would say that, when we send this out, we'll certainly have to have a virtual format, although I'll tell you, just our experience with the Frederick group, the hybrid thing doesn't work so well. So if we don't see like a group, like the majority of our task force wanting to meet in person, then it may not be worthwhile, because I think technology has not always been ideal for us. But, I'm hoping we can do that. I think we could perhaps have more just easier discussions on some of these points, but we'll see how you all feel. I just wanted to let you know that was coming your way, and definitely for your consideration. And I certainly am well aware of everybody's different, we're all on a spectrum and sensitivity to COVID and whether we want to be in person or not, and I respect that fully. And we'll certainly give some option for those of you who want to observe the task force too. We'll have to figure that out as well. So more to come on that, but that's going to be coming your way. So I just wanted to, and with that, I want to thank you so much. I know folks on this task force and some friends of the task force have been putting in a lot of time, a lot of energy, and really thoughtful work about how we can make this program work. And I really appreciate all your efforts, and we're not over yet. We're only kind of midway through. So I really appreciate the kind of diligence that you'll bring to the work ahead. I know the implementation committee has some work ahead, and as do all the committees, to try and finish up and bring forward those recommendations. But thank you again for your time, for your attention, and for your diligence in this work. And we'll reconvene as a group in December, and we'll see you all in committee meetings until then. Okay, thanks again. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.